Beneath the tells of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once carved fertile order from desert chaos, clay tablets still preserve a troubling confession. The scribes who pressed cuneiform into wet earth 4,000 years ago described their knowledge not as achievement but as inheritance, fragments salvaged from an age that ended in water, preserved by those who rebuilt in its aftermath. These tablets speak of a world before the flood, not metaphorically, administratively. They list cities now buried beneath meters of silt. They name rulers whose reigns measured not in decades but in tens of thousands of years. And they describe that earlier world with a precision that suggests the scribes believed they were recording fact, not fantasy. So before the silence deepens, take a moment to subscribe, only if you're drawn to histories that ask what we might have forgotten rather than what we've discovered. And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this quiet stretching across the world, connecting those who wonder whether the beginning we've been taught was actually a second beginning. In the summer of 1849, a British diplomat named Austin Henry Layard stood at the edge of a mound in what is now northern Iraq, staring at fragments of carved stone emerging from centuries of accumulated dust, and he could not have known that what lay beneath his feet would force humanity to reconsider everything it believed about the origins of civilization, because buried under that mound were the remains of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, and within its ruins rested a library that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years, waiting in silence for someone to unearth its secrets. And when Layard and his workers began to dig, they discovered room after room filled with clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked and catalogued with a precision that suggested the people who created this archive understood that knowledge could be lost, and they were determined to prevent that loss at any cost. And as the tablets were carefully transported to the British Museum, and scholars began the painstaking work of translation, they encountered something that none of them were prepared for, because these tablets did not simply record the history of Assyria or Babylon. They reached back further into a past so distant that the scribes who copied them admitted they were working from sources they themselves considered ancient. And among these texts were references to a world that existed before a great flood, a world governed by rulers whose reigns stretched across tens of thousands of years, recorded not as poetry or myth, but in the same flat administrative tone used for counting grain and measuring fields. And this discovery set in motion a century of excavation and translation that would reveal a pattern so consistent and so troubling that it continues to challenge our understanding of how civilization began, because the Sumerians, the people we credit with inventing writing and mathematics and urban governance, never claimed to have invented anything at all. They claimed only to have remembered it, to have preserved it, to have rebuilt what had been destroyed. And that distinction between invention and inheritance, between creation and recovery, lies at the heart of everything we are about to explore together in the quiet hours ahead. The story proper begins not in ancient Mesopotamia, but in a museum basement in Oxford, where a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle sits behind protective glass, bearing catalogue number WB4 and known to scholars as the Weld-Blundell prism, after the collector who acquired it following its excavation from the ruins of Larsa in 1922, and this small unassuming object contains one of the most complete versions of what historians call the Sumerian king list, a document that was copied and recopied across Mesopotamia for more than 1,000 years from approximately 2100 BCE through the first millennium BCE. And when you first encounter this text, you might expect something grand, something mythological, something that announces itself as the story of gods and heroes. But instead, you find something far more unsettling, because the king list reads like an accounting ledger, like a bureaucratic war record, like the kind of document a government office might produce to track the succession of officials, and it begins with a single line that has troubled historians for more than a century. And that line, when translated from the original Sumerian, reads after kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. And that word descended is where the trouble begins, because the scribes who composed this text did not write that kingship was invented in Eridu, or that humans developed kingship through trial and error, or that some clever ruler seized power and established a dynasty. They wrote that kingship descended from heaven, as though political authority were not a human creation at all, but something that existed before humans claimed it, something that was lowered to earth from somewhere else. And this is not a casual choice of words, because Sumerian is a precise language, and the scribes who used it were trained professionals who understood exactly what they were recording, And they chose to describe the origin of governance not as emergence or development, but as descent, as reception, as inheritance. What follows that opening line makes the implications even more difficult to dismiss, because the king list then proceeds to name the first rulers of Earth and to record their reigns with mathematical precision that seems designed to be taken seriously. And the first king named is Alulim, who ruled from the city of Eridu for 28,800 years, and the second king Alagar ruled for 36,000 years, and the third king Enmenluana of the city. Bad Tibira ruled for 43,200 years, and the list continues through 8 kings and 5 cities, recording a combined total of 241,200 years of their pre-flood governance. And here is where most modern readers stop, because these numbers are obviously impossible, and the temptation is to dismiss the entire document as mythology or propaganda or scribal exaggeration. And scholars have proposed exactly these explanations, suggesting that the numbers represent symbolic ages, or dynastic totals, or astronomical cycles, or simply errors introduced through centuries of copying. But each of these explanations runs into the same problem, which is that the scribes did not treat these numbers as symbolic or approximate or open to interpretation. They recorded them with bureaucratic precision, using the same notation system they used for everything else, and more importantly, they recorded them in multiples of a unit called the se'e, which equals 3,600 years, and which forms the basis of Mesopotamian mathematical code, an astronomical calculation. And when you examine the reign lengths closely, you discover that Alulim's 28,800 years equals exactly 8 Sar, and Alagar's 36,000 years equals exactly 10 Sar, and Enmenluana's 43,200 years equals exactly 12 Sar. And every single pre-flood reign is a precise multiple of this same unit, which suggests not random exaggeration but deliberate calculation, as though the scribes were working with a system they inherited and preserved even if they could no longer fully explain its meaning. The king list maintains this same tone throughout its pre-flood section, never shifting into poetic language, never describing miracles or divine interventions, never explaining why these early kings lived so long, or what made them different from the rulers who came later. And it records not just kings but cities, treating each as a seat of governance in an ordered administrative system, and the cities themselves. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shurupak are not mythological locations but real places that archaeologists have excavated, finding occupation layers stretching back beyond 5000 BCE, and the texts describe kingship moving from city to city in an orderly fashion, as though authority were being transferred through some established protocol rather than seized through war or inherited through bloodline. And then, after recording these 8 rulers and their impossible reigns, the king list contains a single sentence that divides everything that came before from everything that came after. And that sentence reads simply, "Then the flood swept over." And after that line, everything changes, because when the list resumes recording kings after the flood, the numbers collapse, and the first post-flood king Jushur of the city Kish ruled for 1200 years, and his successor Kalasinabel ruled for 960 years, and the numbers continue to decrease through subsequent dynasties, dropping to centuries, then to decades, until by the time the list reaches historically verifiable rulers like Gilgamesh of Uruk, the reign lengths have settled into fully human lifespans of 20 or 30 or 40 years. And this pattern of decreasing reign lengths is not random, but systematic, as though something that once extended life was gradually fading, as though distance from the pre-flood world carried with it a progressive diminishment. And the scribes recorded this transition without commentary, without explanation, without any indication that they found it strange, because to them it was simply what the record showed, and their job was to preserve what they had inherited, not to interpret it. Modern scholarship has struggled with the king list for more than a century, because it resists easy categorization, and the standard approach is to divide the document into mythological and historical sections, accepting the post-flood dynasties as legitimate historical sources while dismissing the pre-flood section as symbolic. But this approach creates its own problems because the document itself makes no such distinction, and the scribes who composed it clearly believed they were recording continuous history from the moment kingship first descended from heaven through their own contemporary dynasties, and the same bureaucratic tone, the same mathematical precision, the same administrative language appears throughout, whether describing rulers who reigned for 40,000 years or rulers who reigned for 40. And if the post-flood section is historically reliable, and it has been confirmed by their independent archaeological evidence again and again, then on what basis do we dismiss the pre-flood section, which appears in the same document written by the same scribal tradition using the same notation system and presenting itself with the same matter-of-fact authority. And perhaps more troubling is the question of why the Sumerians would have created such a document at all, because the king list was not religious literature, and it was not preserved in temples as sacred text. It was a political document used to establish legitimacy and to trace the succession of authority. And if you were a king seeking to legitimize your rule, you would want to connect yourself to an unbroken chain of governance, stretching back to the moment authority first came to Earth, and the pre-flood section serves exactly that function, establishing that kingship itself predates any particular dynasty, and that every subsequent ruler, no matter how powerful, is merely a temporary holder of an office that existed before human history began. The question that emerges from all of this is not whether the pre-flood kings literally ruled for tens of thousands of years, because no serious scholar claims they did, but rather what the Sumerians themselves believed they were recording, and why they preserved these records with such consistency across so many centuries and different cities and competing dynasties. And the answer suggested by the texts themselves is that the Sumerians understood their civilization as a reconstruction rather than an origin, and that they believed the knowledge and systems they inherited had come from an earlier age that ended in catastrophe, and that their primary responsibility was not innovation, but preservation, not creation, but memory. And this worldview appears not just in the king list, but throughout Mesopotamian literature and temple inscriptions that describe rebuilding structures as they were in ancient days, and in colophons that warn scribes to copy texts exactly without alteration, and in legal codes that claim to restore justice as it existed before chaos disrupted the world. And if this interpretation is correct, then the king list is not mythology pretending to be history, but something potentially more unsettling, which is a genuine attempt to preserve memory of a world the scribes themselves could no longer access, or verify a world that had been separated from their own by a catastrophe so complete that only fragments of its records survived, and those fragments became the foundation on which everything that followed was built. When Leonard Woolley arrived at the ancient city of Ur in 1922, he was already one of the most experienced archaeologists of his generation, and he came to Mesopotamia with clear expectations about what he would find, because the standard model of civilization suggested that complex societies developed gradually from simple beginnings, and that the earliest settlements would show primitive construction techniques and limited social organization. And as Woolley's team began to dig, they found exactly what they expected. At first, including the famous royal cemetery with its elaborate burials and golden artifacts dating to approximately 2600 BCE. But then beneath the cemetery they found something else, and that something else was a layer of clean water deposited silt, 11 feet thick, containing no pottery, no bones, no ash, no evidence of human activity of any kind, just sterile sediment laid down by massive flooding, and beneath that barren layer they found an earlier settlement, crushed mud brick walls and collapsed roofs, and pottery of a style that had vanished from the archaeological record, and Woolley immediately recognised the significance of what he had uncovered, and he sent a telegram to the British Museum containing just 4 words: "We have found the flood." The claim was dramatic, and the press coverage that followed was even more dramatic, but the physical evidence was undeniable, because something catastrophic had happened at Ur sometime around 2900 BCE, and it had been severe enough to bury an entire settlement under metres of flood-deposited sediment. And when archaeologists began examining other sites across southern Mesopotamia, they found similar evidence at Kish. They found flood deposits 18 inches thick, dating to approximately the same period, and at Shuruppak, the city the flood hero ruled. According to the Eridu Genesis, they found evidence of violent inundation interrupting occupation layers around 2900 BCE, and at Uruk they found stratigraphic gaps suggesting catastrophic flooding followed by rebuilding, and the pattern emerged across site after site. And what became clear was that whatever the king list was describing was not pure fantasy, but corresponded to a real catastrophic event or series of events that struck the Mesopotamian plain around the end of the 4th millennium BCE, and that these floods were severe enough to destroy cities and disrupt civilization and force survivors to rebuild from whatever fragments they could salvage. And this changes how we must read the texts, because when the king list says "then the flood swept over," it is not speaking metaphorically or symbolically, but describing something that left its signature in the archaeological record in layers of sterile silt that archaeologists can measure and date and map across the landscape. What makes the flood deposits even more significant is what appears above them, because the cities that rebuilt after the catastrophe were not primitive restarts, and they did not show the gradual development from simple to complex that evolutionary models predict. Instead, they carried forward sophisticated irrigation systems and astronomical alignments and mathematical frameworks and writing systems already mature enough to handle abstract concepts. And when you examine the earliest post-flood temples at Eridu, you find that they were built on exactly the same foundations as the pre-flood temples and aligned to exactly the same orientations and following exactly the same architectural plans, as though the builders were deliberately replicating something they remembered or had preserved in records. And the same pattern appears at site after site where post-flood construction does not innovate but restores, and where the goal of builders seems not to improve upon the past but to recreate it as faithfully as possible. And one inscription from a post-flood temple dedication at Nippur contains a phrase that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian building records, and that phrase reads, "This is the restoration of what was before." And that word restoration is crucial because it implies that what we call the birth of Sumerian civilization was understood by its creators not as a beginning at all, but as a recovery. The flood then was not just a catastrophe that destroyed cities and killed people and covered settlements in mud, it was a dividing line between two fundamentally different worlds. And the texts describe this division with complete consistency. The pre-flood world had rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the post-flood world had rulers who reigned for decades, and the pre-flood world had kingship that descended directly from heaven, and the post-flood world had kingship that was contested and seized and lost through war, and the pre-flood world had divine administrators who governed cities in person according to some texts, and the post-flood world had distant gods who communicated only through dreams and omens and priests, and something ended at the flood, something more than just buildings and people, something systemic, something that defined how the world was organized and how authority functioned and and how humans related to whatever they understood as divine. And the text preserved this transition with documentary precision, as though the scribes recognized that they were living in the aftermath of a fundamental change. And their primary duty was to maintain whatever connection to the earlier order could still be maintained. And this is why they copied the king list generation after generation, because it was not just history but constitutional documentation establishing that the institution of kingship itself predated any particular ruler, and that every subsequent dynasty was merely continuing an office that had descended from heaven before human memory began. What exactly ended at the flood remains the central question of this investigation, and the texts offer partial answers without ever providing complete explanation, because they describe a world before the catastrophe that operated under different rules, and that was governed by beings whose nature remains frustratingly unclear. And the king list itself offers hints, when it describes the pre-flood rulers using terminology that sometimes includes divine determinatives and sometimes does not, as though the scribes themselves were uncertain about the category these figures belonged to. And other texts from the same period describe the Anunnaki, the great gods who decreed destinies not as distant creators dwelling in abstraction, but as present administrators who allocated resources and settled disputes and established laws, and the language used is remarkably bureaucratic, as though describing a government rather than a pantheon. And these Anunnaki, according to the earliest sources, do not perform miracles or inspire worship in the way later gods would. Instead, they measure and decree and allocate and judge using language that sounds less like religion and more like civil administration. And then after the flood, they withdraw, not destroyed and not overthrown, just absent, stepping back from direct involvement and leaving humanity to manage alone. And this withdrawal is never explained. It is simply recorded as though it were a fact the scribes could not account for, but also could not deny. If something ended at the flood, and if that something involved a form of governance or presence or order that did not continue afterward, then the entire framework through which we understand the origins of civilization requires reconsideration, because we have been taught that civilization developed progressively, that humans invented writing and mathematics and urban planning through trial and error, and that the earliest societies were the simplest, gradually becoming more complex over time. But the Sumerians themselves told a completely different story in which the knowledge they possessed was not invented but inherited, and in which their civilization was not an origin but a reconstruction, and in which the most important achievements of their culture were attributed not to human genius but to transmission from an earlier age. And this is not the narrative of a people who believed they were creating something new. This is the narrative of inheritors struggling to maintain what they had been given, terrified of losing what little they still understood. and dedicating their entire scribal culture to the preservation of records whose full meaning was already slipping beyond their grasp. And if they were right, if the Sumerians genuinely were inheritors rather than inventors, if the flood really did mark the end of something that existed before then, the question becomes unavoidable, and that question is, what exactly did the Sumerians believe existed before the waters rose and what was lost? When the ancient world drowned, and how much of what we consider the beginning of civilization was actually a second beginning, built on fragments salvaged from a catastrophe we have been taught to consider myth. The texts speak of 5 cities that existed before the waters rose, and these 5 cities were not random settlements scattered across the Mesopotamian plain, but specific administrative centres, each assigned to a particular function, and each governed by rulers whose names the king list preserves with the same bureaucratic precision it applies to everything else. And understanding what the Sumerians believed about these cities requires setting aside modern assumptions about how civilization develops, because we tend to imagine cities emerging organically from villages as populations grow and social structures become more complex. But the Sumerian texts describe something entirely different. They describe cities that were established by decree that were assigned to divine administrators, and that served specific purposes within a larger organized system. And the first of these cities, and according to multiple independent texts, the first city ever built on Earth, was Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq, near the modern town of Abu Shahrain. And when Iraqi archaeologists began systematic excavation of Eridu in the 1940s, they expected to find evidence supporting the standard developmental model of civilization, with simple structures at the lowest levels becoming progressively more sophisticated as you moved upward through time. But what they found instead has troubled archaeologists for decades, because at the very bottom of the excavation, beneath 18 distinct construction phases, they discovered Temple 1, the oldest religious structure at the site. And Temple 1 was not a crude hut or a simple altar, but a sophisticated rectangular shrine with niched walls and an offering platform, and a central altar positioned to face a specific direction, and radiocarbon dating placed this structure around 5400 BCE, making it older than the first dynasties, older than the invention of writing as we understand it, and older than any kingship the historical record can verify. What makes Eridu genuinely mysterious is not just the sophistication of its earliest temple, but what happened in the centuries and millennia that followed. Because above Temple 1, archaeologists found Temple 2 built on exactly the same plan, slightly larger, but following the same orientation, the same internal layout, the same positioning of the altar. And above Temple 2 they found Temple 3, again this same design, proportionally expanded but architecturally identical, and this pattern continued through Temple 4 and Temple 5 and Temple 6 all the way up through 18 distinct construction phases spanning more than 3,000 years. And in all that time, across all those rebuildings, through all the dynasties that rose and fell and all the political changes that swept across Mesopotamia, the basic design of the Eridu temple never changed, and the orientation never shifted, and the sacred geometry was maintained with absolute fidelity, as though the builders across all those generations were working from a template they believed was original and unalterable and sacred in a way that transcended any individual ruler or dynasty. And each time a temple was destroyed or fell into disrepair, the new builders did not innovate or improve but replicated, and each time they buried the previous structure beneath clean sand before constructing the next, as though performing a ritual of preservation, and each time they aligned their new construction to match what had been there before, as though maintaining continuity with something older than memory. The question this raises is deceptively simple: where did the original design come from? And if Temple 1 was already sophisticated, already oriented to specific astronomical alignments, already following architectural principles that would persist for 3 millennia, then someone or something must have established that template before the first brick was laid, and the Sumerians themselves had an answer to this question, though it is not an answer. Modern archaeology is equipped to evaluate because they believe that Eridu was sacred, because it was the first seat of kingship, the place where authority first descended from heaven, and the city was associated with the god Enki, who in Sumerian theology was the lord of wisdom and fresh water, and the keeper of the Emi, the divine principles that governed civilization. And according to the texts, it was Enki who established the original order that later generations were obligated to maintain. And it was from Enki that the knowledge of proper construction and proper ritual and proper governance flowed, and the 18 temples built one atop another across 3,000 years were not innovations but acts of devotion, attempts to maintain connection with an original, pattern that the builders believed came from outside human invention, and whether you interpret Enki as a literal deity, or as a mythologized memory of some earlier source of knowledge, or as a symbolic representation of inherited wisdom, the function remains the same, which is that the Sumerians understood their most sacred architecture not as creation, but as replication, and not as progress, but as preservation. Bad Tibira. The second of the 5 antediluvian cities presents a different set of mysteries, because while Eridu was associated with wisdom and governance, Bad Tibira was associated with metalworking and craft, and the city's name itself means Fortress of the Smiths, suggesting an industrial function that distinguished it from the religious administration of Eridu, and the king list records that Bad Tibira was the second seat of kingship after it was transferred from Eridu, and that 2 kings ruled there before the flood, En-Men-Luana for 43,200 years, and En-Mangalana for 28,800 years, and while the reign lengths remain as impossible as ever, what interests scholars is the specificity of the city's function, because the texts suggest that the pre-flood world was not a simple, undifferentiated society, but a complex administrative system with different cities serving different purposes, and metalworking in the ancient world was not a minor craft, but a transformative technology that required sophisticated knowledge of ore processing and alloy composition and temperature control. And the association of Bad Tibira with smithing suggests that this knowledge too was understood as having originated in the pre-flood period as something that was practiced before the catastrophe and had to be recovered or continued afterward. And archaeological evidence from the region shows that bronze working and copper processing were indeed established in Mesopotamia from very early periods, with techniques that appear surprisingly sophisticated for their supposed developmental stewardship. Larak, the third antediluvian city, is more obscure than the others and has not been definitively identified archaeologically, but the texts associate it with Pabilsag, a figure connected to astronomical observation and the measurement of time, and this association matters because it suggests that the pre-flood administrative system included a city dedicated specifically to tracking celestial movements and calculating calendars. And if accurate, this would mean that the astronomical knowledge the Sumerians possessed was not developed after the flood, but was understood as having originated before it as part of the original order that was established when kingship first descended, and the sophistication of Mesopotamian astronomy is one of the most puzzling aspects of the civilization, because the observations required to produce their astronomical tables would have taken centuries of continuous systematic recording, and yet the tablets present this knowledge as already complete, already verified, already reduced to mathematical formulas that could predict planetary positions years in advance. And if Larak really was a pre-flood center for astronomical observation, then the Sumerians were claiming that this centuries-long process of data collection occurred before the catastrophe, and that what they possessed afterward was the preserved result of that earlier work. Sippar, the 4th city, was associated with Utu, the sun god, and with concepts of justice and truth, and the city's name connects it to the Sumerian word for scribe, suggesting a function related to writing and record-keeping. And of all the antediluvian cities, Sippar plays the most intriguing role in flood narratives, because according to one tradition, it was at Sippar that the knowledge of civilization was buried before the catastrophe to protect it from the coming waters, and that after the flood the survivors were instructed to dig at Sippar and recover what had been hidden, and this tradition appears in the writings of Berossus, a Babylonian priest who composed a history of Mesopotamia in Greek around 280 BCE, and while Berossus was writing late and in a foreign language, he claimed to be drawing on ancient Babylonian temple records, and his account includes the detail that the flood hero was commanded to bury all available writings at Sippar, and that these writings contained the beginnings and middles and ends of all things, and that humanity was to dig them up after the waters receded and use them to rebuild civilization. And whether this tradition preserves genuine ancient belief or represents later elaboration, the function it describes is consistent with what we find throughout Mesopotamian literature, which is the idea that knowledge had to be physically preserved through catastrophe, and that what later generations possessed was not discovery but recovery. Shuruppak, the 5th and final antediluvian city, holds special significance because it was the home of the flood hero himself, the figure called Ziusudra in Sumerian texts and Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. And according to the king list, Shuruppak was the last seat of kingship before the flood, and its ruler was Ubaratutu, who reigned for 18,600 years before the waters came and the city was real and has been excavated, and the archaeological evidence shows exactly what the texts describe, which is a settlement that was destroyed by catastrophic flooding around 2900 BCE, with a clear stratigraphic break between what came before and what came after, and the flood deposits at Shuruppak are among the most dramatic of any site, with evidence of sudden violent inundation, followed by abandonment, and then eventual reoccupation. And the association of this specific city with the flood narrative is not mythological convenience but geographical accuracy, because Shuruppak sat in a particularly vulnerable position on the Mesopotamian plain and would have been devastated by major flooding of the Euphrates, and the text placed the flood hero here because this is where the catastrophe struck hardest, and this is where survival would have required exactly the kind of preparation the narrative describes. What emerges from examining all 5 cities together is a picture of an organised pre-flood world that the Sumerians believed had been destroyed but not entirely erased, and each city served a specific function within a larger system, and the cities were not independent polities competing for resources, but administrative units within a governed territory. And kingship moved from city to city, according to some protocol that the texts do not fully explain but treat as legitimate and orderly, and the question of whether this picture reflects historical reality, or theological projection or cultural memory of some earlier state of organisation is less important than the fact that the Sumerians themselves clearly believed it and structured their entire civilization around the attempt to maintain continuity with it. And when they rebuilt after the flood, they did not build new cities according to the new plans, but rebuilt the same cities on the same sites, with the same orientations, following the same patterns, because to innovate would have been to admit that the original was lost, and their entire identity was constructed around the premise that it was not lost but preserved, and that their responsibility was not creation but continuation. The ME provide the most comprehensive window into what the Sumerians believed they had inherited from before the flood, because the ME were not objects or buildings, but principles, the fundamental laws and structures and capacities that made civilization possible, and the word ME is usually translated as divine decrees or divine powers or cultural norms, but none of these translations quite capture what the texts describe, because the ME were treated not as abstractions but as real things that could be possessed and transferred and stolen and lost. And one of the most important texts describing the ME is the myth of Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki, the keeper of the ME, and through trickery involving beer and seduction, she convinces Enki to give her the ME one by one, and she loads them onto her boat and carries them back to her city Uruk. And the text lists over 100 ME that Inanna obtains, and the list is extraordinary in its scope because it includes not just what we might expect like kingship and priesthood and truth, but also things like the descent into the underworld, and the ascent from the underworld, and the art of metalworking and the art of leatherworking, and the scribal art and wisdom and understanding and fear and strife and victory and defeat, and sexual intercourse and prostitution and counselling and judgment and decision-making, and the list continues through every aspect of civilized existence, as though the Sumerians had catalogued every element required for a functioning society and attributed each one to a divine source. What makes the ME conceptually profound is not their content but their origin, because the myth makes clear that the ME existed before Inanna took them, and before Enki held them, and before any human practiced them, and the ME were not invented by humans through experimentation or developed through social evolution, but were part of the cosmic order that preceded human history. And when Enki gave the ME to Inanna, he was not creating something new, but transferring something ancient. And when Inanna brought the ME to Uruk, she was not innovating, but accessing principles that already existed waiting to be claimed. And this understanding of knowledge and civilization as access rather than creation, as discovery rather than invention, pervades Sumerian thought, and it means that for the Sumerians progress was not possible in the way we understand it, because you cannot improve upon divine decrees, and you cannot develop beyond cosmic principles, and the only direction of movement is backward, toward the original source, or downward toward loss and degradation. And this worldview explains why Mesopotamian culture was so oriented toward preservation, because if your knowledge comes from before human history, and if losing it means never being able to recreate it, then every tablet must be copied exactly, and every temple must be rebuilt to the original plan, and every ritual must be performed precisely as it was performed before. The philosophical implications of the ME extend beyond Mesopotamian theology into questions about the nature of knowledge itself, because if you believe that the principles governing your civilization were inherited rather than created, then your relationship to those principles is fundamentally different from someone who believes their society is a human construction, and you cannot casually alter what you did not make, and you cannot discard traditions, whose origins you do not understand, and you must maintain systems whose full complexity may exceed your comprehension, because the alternative is not reform but collapse. And this explains why Mesopotamian scribes spent their lives copying texts whose meaning was already becoming obscure, and why kings rebuilt temples to specifications they could not fully explain, and why legal codes invoked ancient authority rather than royal decree, and the entire civilization was organized around the principle that what mattered most was not innovation but transmission, and that the highest achievement was not creating something new, but preserving something old, and that the measure of a reign or a dynasty or a scribal career was how faithfully you maintained what you had received. And if this sounds limiting or stagnant to modern ears, shaped by centuries of progressive ideology, it is worth remembering that Mesopotamian civilization endured for more than 3,000 years and produced achievements in mathematics and astronomy and literature and law that would not be matched for millennia. And perhaps the preservation impulse was not weakness but strength, and perhaps the ME were not primitive theology, but sophisticated cultural technology for maintaining complex systems across catastrophic disruptions. The practical expression of ME inheritance appears most clearly in the knowledge systems that Sumerian civilization possessed, because these systems do not show the gradual developmental progression that we expect from human invention, but appear in the archaeological and textual record already sophisticated and already functional. And the most striking example is cuneiform writing itself, which appears around 3400 BC in the city of Uruk, and which from its earliest attestation includes more than 1,200 distinct signs capable of representing syllables and words and abstract concepts, and the writing system is not simple pictographs struggling toward language, but a mature technology immediately capable of recording contracts and inventories and literary compositions, and the question of where this sophistication came from has puzzled scholars since the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century, because writing systems are supposed to develop gradually from simple pictures to standardized symbols to phonetic signs over many generations, and yet cuneiform appears without identifiable predecessors and without the experimental phases and dead ends that should accompany human invention. And one explanation is that the developmental stages occurred earlier and were lost, and another is that the system was developed rapidly through deliberate design rather than organic evolution, and another is that the scribes who used cuneiform knew something about its origins that we do not. The mathematical knowledge embedded in Sumerian tablets presents similar puzzles, because the Sumerians used a base 60 system that still governs our measurement of time, and angles with 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, and this system appears complete in the earliest mathematical tablets without simpler predecessors, and without the kind of gradual refinement that we expect from human mathematical development. And the sophistication of what the system could accomplish is demonstrated by tablets like the one catalogued as Questi in the British Museum, which contains a geometric problem calculating the diagonal of a rectangle using what we now call the Pythagorean theorem. And this tablet dates to approximately 1800 BCE, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. And more importantly, it presents the solution not as a new discovery, but as established knowledge, not as something the scribe worked out, but as something he copied from older sources. And the colophon at the bottom of the tablet identifies the content as a wisdom from the House of Enki, which places its origin not in human, mathematical investigation, but in the same divine source that the Sumerians credited with all their fundamental knowledge. Astronomical knowledge presents perhaps the most troubling puzzle of all, because accurate astronomy requires not just intelligence, but time and the observations necessary to track planetary cycles and predict eclipses and calculate the length of the year to within seconds of modern measurements would have taken centuries of continuous systematic recording. And yet the Mesopotamian astronomical tablets present this knowledge as already complete and already reduced to mathematical formulas, and the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, which records the appearances and disappearances of Venus over a 21-year period, demonstrates accuracy that presupposes generations of prior observation, and the tablet is dated to around 1650 BCE, but it explicitly states that it was copied from older sources dating to the reign of Amisaduqa around 1700 BC, which were themselves described as copies from still older originals, and when you trace the chain of copying backward, you eventually reach sources that the scribes themselves described as ancient writings from before the flood, and whether this description is literally accurate or represents traditional attribution to establish authority. The function is the same, which is that the Sumerians understood their astronomical knowledge not as discovery but as inheritance, and not as achievement but as preservation. Medical knowledge follows the same pattern, with diagnostic handbooks that describe symptoms and treatments with clinical precision that should require extensive empirical observation, and yet these handbooks present their content as received wisdom, not as the result of experiments, and the surgical procedures described assume anatomical knowledge that should come from centuries of practice, and the pharmacological recipes assume understanding of plant and mineral properties that should emerge from generations of trial and error, and yet the texts do not describe discovery or experimentation, but transmission, with later scribes copying earlier tablets and those earlier tablets claiming descent from still earlier sources until the chain disappears into the pre-flood past. And the same is true of legal codes, which appear already sophisticated, with the Code of Ur Nammu dating to around 2100 BCE, presenting a mature legal philosophy with graduated penalties and distinctions between intentional and accidental harm, and protections for vulnerable populations. And all of this framed not as royal innovation, but as restoration of justice as it existed in ancient times, before chaos disrupted the proper order. The absence of developmental stages in Sumerian knowledge systems has been explained in various ways by modern scholars, and the most common explanation is that the developmental stages occurred and the records simply did not survive. And according to this view, the Sumerians really did invent writing through gradual experimentation, and really did develop mathematics through accumulated practice, and really did build astronomical knowledge through centuries of observation. But the early records of this process were lost to time, and what we have are only the mature results. And this explanation is plausible and may be correct, but it requires ignoring what the Sumerians themselves said about their knowledge, which is that it came from before, which is that it was given not discovered, which is that their role was preservation, not creation. And the alternative explanation, which mainstream scholarship cannot accept, but which the texts themselves consistently propose, is that the developmental stages did occur, but they occurred before the flood, and what the Sumerians possessed was not the result of their own investigation, but the preserved fragments of an earlier civilization's achievements passed down through catastrophe and maintained through deliberate transmission. And if this alternative is even partially true, then everything we think we know about the origins of civilization requires reconsideration. The question of what the Sumerians themselves believed cannot be definitively answered, but the weight of textual evidence points in a consistent direction, because every time they described their knowledge, they described it as inherited, and every time they credited its source, they credited the pre-flood world or the gods who governed that world. And every time they copied their tablets, they copied them exactly with warnings not to alter what had been received. And every time they rebuilt their temples, they rebuilt them to ancient specifications, and every time they legislated, they claimed to restore ancient justice, and this consistency across centuries and cities and dynasties is remarkable, because competing polities should produce competing claims, and evolving societies should produce evolving narratives. But Mesopotamian civilization maintained the same fundamental story, about its own origins from beginning to end, and that story was that they were not first, and that what they knew came from before, and that the most they could hope for was to maintain what they had received until the end of whatever age they were living through. And this is not the story a civilization tells about itself when it believes it is ascending, and this is not the narrative of innovation and progress and human achievement, but the narrative of inheritance and preservation, and the weight of maintaining what you did not create. What does it mean to believe your civilization is operating according to principles you inherited, rather than created? And what does it do to a culture to organize itself around preservation rather than innovation? And how does it shape individual lives to believe that the highest achievement is faithful copying rather than original creation? And these questions matter not just for understanding ancient Mesopotamia, but for understanding ourselves, because we have inherited a different story, a story of progress and development and human self-creation, and we believe that civilization is something we build, not something we receive, and we believe that knowledge is something we discover, not something we preserve, and we believe that the future will be better than the past, and that innovation is always superior to tradition. And perhaps we are right, and perhaps the Sumerian worldview was simply wrong, a product of limited understanding and theological projection, and perhaps the developmental stages really did occur, and the Sumerians simply mythologized what was actually human achievement into divine gift. And this is the standard scholarly view, And it may be correct, but it requires explaining why the Sumerians would have invented a narrative that diminishes their own accomplishments, and why they would have credited gods for what they could have credited to human genius, and why they would have constructed an entire civilization around principles of preservation. If they knew those principles had no foundation, and perhaps the answer is that they did not know, and perhaps they were mistaken, and perhaps they were simply religious in a way we no longer understand, and perhaps the whole matter can be set aside as ancient theology with no bearing on historical truth, but perhaps also the consistency of their claims deserves more attention than it has received, and perhaps the absence of developmental stages in their knowledge systems deserves more explanation than it has been given, and perhaps the question of what the Sumerians believed they inherited is worth taking seriously, even if we cannot determine whether what they believed was accurate. If the Sumerians believed their knowledge was inherited rather than invented, then someone or something must have transmitted that knowledge across the catastrophe, and the texts are remarkably specific about who performed this function, because they describe a group of beings called Apkallu, word usually translated as the wise ones or the sages who appeared in the earliest times and who taught humanity the arts of civilization. And these Apkallu were not human, or at least not entirely human, and the descriptions preserved in texts and depicted in cylinder seals and carved on palace reliefs show figures that combine human and animal characteristics most commonly, human bodies wearing garments made from fish skins with the fish head forming a hood over the human head and the fish body trailing down the back like a cloak. And these images appear across thousands of years of Mesopotamian art from those earliest cylinder seals through the monumental reliefs of the Assyrian palaces, and the consistency of the depiction suggests that the Mesopotamians were representing something specific, something they believed had a definite appearance and a definite function in the early history of their world. And what that function was, according to every text that mentions them, was teaching and transmission and the establishment of the patterns that later generations would be obligated to maintain. The fullest account of the Apkallu comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest who served in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon during the 3rd century BCE, and who composed a history of Mesopotamia in Greek for the benefit of the new Hellenistic rulers who had conquered the region following Alexander the Great. And while Berossus was writing late, and in a foreign language, he claimed to be drawing on ancient temple records, and his account has been partially confirmed by cuneiform texts discovered since his work was translated. And according to Berossus, in the first year of human civilization, a being emerged from the Persian Gulf where it borders Babylonia, and this being had the body of a fish, but underneath the fish head was another head which was human, and human feet emerged from beneath the fishtail, and it had a human voice, and this being whose name was Oannes spent its days among humanity, teaching writing and sciences and arts of every kind, and teaching the construction of cities and the founding of temples and the establishment of laws, and teaching geometry and the collection of seeds and harvests and everything that constitutes civilized life. And when the sun set, this being returned to the sea and spent the night beneath the waters. And Berossus emphasizes that nothing further was invented after what Oannes taught, because everything necessary for civilization was transmitted in that first generation. The account continues with additional beings of the same kind emerging from the sea during subsequent reigns, and Berossus names 7 of these figures in total, each appearing during the reign of a specific antediluvian king, and each contributing to the transmission of knowledge. And these 7 sages correspond to the Apkallu of the cuneiform text, which also number 7, and which are also associated with specific pre-flood kings and specific cities in the correspondence between Berossus writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE and the cuneiform tablets composed 1,000 or more years earlier demonstrates that this tradition was stable and consistent across the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization, and the function of the Apkallu was always the same, which was to serve as intermediaries between a higher source of knowledge and the human population that needed to receive it, and to establish the patterns of civilization that would continue long after their direct involvement ended, and they were not creators in their own right, but transmitters, and the knowledge they brought was not their invention, but something they themselves had received from whatever realm they emerged from when they rose from the waters. The Bitmesri texts, which describe protective rituals against evil spirits, provide additional detail about the Apkallu because these rituals involve the invocation of the 7 sages as protective figures, and the texts describe small figurines of the Apkallu that were buried in the foundations of buildings to provide supernatural protection, and the descriptions of these figurines match the depictions on cylinder seals and palace reliefs with the characteristic fish cloak and the human form beneath. And what is interesting about these ritual texts is that they treat the Apkallu as figures from the distant past, who are no longer physically present but whose power can still be accessed through proper ritual invocation. And this represents a shift from the pre-flood role described by Berossus and the King List, where the Apkallu were active teachers walking among humans and transmitting knowledge directly to a post-flood role, where they have withdrawn from direct contact and function only as spiritual protectors summoned through ceremony. And this shift parallels the broader pattern we have been tracing, where the pre-flood world involved direct contact between humans and higher beings, and the post-flood world involves only mediated access through ritual and priesthood and preserved texts. Each of the 7 Apkallu was associated with a specific city and a specific king, and the texts preserve these associations with the same bureaucratic precision they apply to everything else. And the first Apkallu, named Wanna, which is the Sumerian form of the name Berossus rendered as Oannes, was associated with the city of Eridu, and the king Ayelu and Uana is described as he who finished the plans for heaven and earth, which suggests a function not just of teaching but of completing some cosmic design. And the second Apkallu, named Uanaduga, was associated with the king Alalga, and is described as possessing comprehensive intelligence, and the third, named Enmadugga, was associated with the king Ameluana and is described as allotted a good destiny, and the associations continue through all 7 matching sages to kings and functions in a systematic way that suggests an organised administrative structure rather than random mythological accumulation. And each sage was understood to have brought specific knowledge, and each city was understood to have received specific teachings, and the pre-flood world, as the texts describe it, was not a primitive beginning, but an organised transmission of established knowledge to populations that were being prepared to maintain civilization after the teachers departed. The physical descriptions of the Apkallu raise questions that the texts do not answer, because if these figures were purely symbolic or theological constructs, then why describe their appearance with such specificity, and why depict them so consistently across thousands of years of artistic production? And the fish cloak imagery has been interpreted in various ways, with some scholars suggesting it represents priests wearing ritual costumes made from fish skins, and others suggesting it represents amphibious beings who could survive in water and on land, and others suggesting it is purely symbolic, connecting the sages to Enki, the god of fresh water, who was their ultimate source, and each interpretation has evidence to support it, and none can be definitively ruled out. But what matters more than the literal truth of the descriptions is what they reveal about how the Mesopotamians understood the transmission of knowledge, because they believed that the arts of civilization did not develop locally through human experimentation, but arrived from elsewhere, brought by beings who were not fully human, and who possessed knowledge that humans could receive but could not have generated on their own. The pattern of culture bringing figures is not unique to Mesopotamia, because similar traditions appear in civilizations across the ancient world with no documented contact with each other, and in Egypt the god Thoth was credited with teaching writing and mathematics and astronomy and medicine to humanity, and Thoth was depicted with the head of an ibis, or sometimes as a baboon, and was described as possessing all knowledge and recording all things, and like the Apkallu, Thoth did not create the knowledge he transmitted, but served as an intermediary between a higher cosmic order and the human population that needed access to it. And in Mesoamerica, the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was credited with teaching agriculture and astronomy, and the calendar and crafts to the peoples of Mexico, and Quetzalcoatl was described as having arrived from across the sea and as having departed with a promise to return, and the similarities between these traditions are striking enough that some researchers have proposed direct contact between ancient civilizations, while others argue that the similarities reflect universal human tendencies to attribute sophisticated knowledge to superhuman sources rather than accepting it as human achievement. The question of whether these parallel traditions represent independent development, or shared memory, or some form of actual historical connection cannot be answered definitively with available evidence, but the pattern itself deserves attention because it appears too consistently across too many unconnected civilizations to be coincidental, and in each case the culture-bringing figure arrives from elsewhere, and in each case the figure is not fully human, and in each case the knowledge transmitted includes the same core elements of writing and mathematics and astronomy and agriculture and architecture and law, and in each case the figure eventually departs or withdraws, leaving humanity to maintain what was transmitted without further direct assistance. And whether this pattern represents a universal mythological archetype, or a shared memory of actual events, or something else entirely, The function is the same, which is to establish that civilization is not a human creation but a human inheritance, and that the knowledge-enabling complex society was received from a source beyond human capacity to generate. The transmission of knowledge across the flood catastrophe presents a practical problem that the texts address directly, because if the antediluvian world possessed sophisticated knowledge, and if that world was destroyed by catastrophic flooding, then the knowledge should have been lost with it. And the fact that post-flood civilization possessed this knowledge requires explanation, and the text provides several complementary explanations that together describe a deliberate effort to preserve what would otherwise have been destroyed. And the first explanation involves the flood hero himself, the figure called Ziusudra in Sumerian and Utnapishtim in Babylonian, and Noah in the much later biblical tradition. And according to the Mesopotamian accounts, this figure was warned of the coming flood by the god Enki, who instructed him to build a boat and to load it with representatives of all living things. And this story is famous and has been retold countless times, but what is often overlooked is that the flood hero was not just a survivor, but a preserver. And the texts describe him bringing onto the boat not just animals and family members, but the knowledge necessary to restart civilization. The tradition of buried tablets provides the most concrete account of how knowledge was physically preserved across the catastrophe, because according to this tradition, the flood hero was instructed to gather all available writings and to bury them at Sippar before the waters came, and Sippar was the city associated with the sun god Utu and with justice and record keeping. And the choice of Sippar as the burial site was not arbitrary, but reflected the city's function within the pre-flood administrative system. And according to Brossus, whose account preserves this tradition in detail, the writings buried at Sippar contain the beginnings and middles and ends of all things, which suggests not just practical knowledge, but comprehensive cosmic understanding. And after the flood, the survivors were instructed to dig at Sippar, recover what had been buried, and use these recovered writings to rebuild civilization. And whether this tradition preserves historical memory or theological construction or some combination of both, the function is clear, which is to explain how post-flood humanity possessed knowledge that should have been lost, and to establish that this knowledge was not rediscovered but recovered, and that the civilization that emerged after the catastrophe was continuous with what had existed before. Archaeological evidence provides unexpected support for traditions of deliberate tablet burial, because excavations across Mesopotamia have revealed foundation deposits containing deliberately buried inscriptions and objects placed beneath buildings at the time of their construction, and these foundation deposits often include tablets describing the building's purpose and the king who commissioned it. And invocations of divine protection and the practice of burying texts for future recovery was clearly established and widespread, and while most surviving foundation deposits date to historical periods, the practice itself is ancient, and the text describing pre-flood tablet burial may reflect actual Mesopotamian methods of preserving important documents. And more striking is the evidence of kings excavating for earlier foundation deposits, as demonstrated most dramatically by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who ruled in the 6th century BC and who was obsessed with recovering ancient inscriptions. And Nabonidus describes in his own inscriptions how he dug beneath temples searching for the original foundation deposits left by rulers who had built thousands of years earlier, and how he carefully preserved and reburied what he found, and his inscriptions describe the excitement of discovering tablets from the reign of Naram Sin of Akkad, who ruled around 2250 BCE, and Hammurabi of Babylon, who ruled around 1750 BCE, and in each case Nabonidus treats these ancient documents with reverence and describes using them to ensure that his own construction follows the original plans. The colophons attached to clay tablets provide direct evidence of the preservation culture that defined Mesopotamian scribal practice, because colophons are the notes that scribes added at the end of tablets, identifying the source of the text and the circumstances of copying and the scribal identity. And these colophons frequently include phrases that reveal how the Sumerians and their successors understood their relationship to the knowledge they were transmitting. And common phrases include copied from ancient tablets and written according to the ancient text, and like the original it was written and checked and let no one alter it. And whoever alters this may Nabu curse him, and these phrases reveal that the scribes understood themselves not as authors creating new content, but as transmitters preserving existing content, and that accuracy was a sacred obligation, and that alteration was not just prohibited but cursed. And this attitude makes sense only if the knowledge being transmitted was understood as having a source beyond human capacity to recreate, because if knowledge can be reinvented, then losing it is inconvenient but not catastrophic. But if knowledge is received from a source that is no longer accessible, then losing it means losing it forever, and every copying error becomes an irreversible degradation of the inheritance. The chain of transmission that the colophons describe stretches backward through centuries, and in some cases the chain extends so far that it reaches beyond verifiable history into the antediluvian past, and tablets will describe themselves as copies of copies of copies with the original source attributed to ancient times, or the time before the flood, or the reign of a pre-flood king, and scholars typically interpret these attributions as conventional formulas designed to establish authority rather than literal historical claims. But the Sumerians themselves did not distinguish between legitimate attribution and conventional formula in the way that modern criticism demands, and when a scribe wrote that his text was copied from an ancient original from before the flood, he may have believed exactly what he wrote, and the tablet may have been part of a genuine chain of transmission extending back beyond his ability to verify and whether the original source was truly antediluvian or merely very old. The function of the attribution was to locate the text's authority in the past and to position the scribe as a faithful link in a chain that he was obligated to maintain. One of the most revealing aspects of Mesopotamian scribal culture is the anxiety about loss that pervades the textual record, because the scribes were clearly aware that knowledge could be and was being lost, and their response to this awareness was intensified. Preservation effort and tablets describe themselves as restored from damaged originals or reconstructed from fragments or pieced together from multiple partial sources, and scribes complain about the difficulty of reading ancient tablets whose signs have become obscure or whose language has shifted, and royal libraries were established not primarily to produce new knowledge, but to gather and preserve existing knowledge, and the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which preserved so much of what we now know about Mesopotamian civilization, was assembled through systematic collection of tablets from across the empire, with scribes sent to find and copy texts from temple libraries and private collections. And the king himself describes his motivation not as curiosity or scholarship, but as the duty to preserve what was in danger of being lost, and this attitude persisted across the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization, with later generations consistently oriented toward the past, and consistently anxious that the connection to that past might be severed. The question of what the Sumerians were actually preserving remains open, because two very different answers are possible, and both are consistent with the evidence. And the first answer is that they were preserving genuine knowledge transmitted from a pre-flood civilization that really did exist, and that really did possess the sophisticated systems that appear suddenly in the archaeological record. And according to this view, the texts are accurate in their essential claims, and the Apkallu were real in some sense, and the buried tablets of Sippar contained real information, and the chain of transmission that the colophons describe was a real chain connecting post-flood civilization to its antediluvian predecessor. And this view takes the texts seriously as historical sources, while acknowledging that the details may be distorted or mythologized, and it explains the absence of developmental stages in Sumerian knowledge by positing that the development occurred before the flood, and what we see as the preserved result rather than the process. The second answer is that the Sumerians were creating a mythology of preservation to legitimize knowledge that they actually developed themselves, and according to this view, the texts are theological constructions designed to attribute human achievement to divine sources and to establish the authority of ruling institutions by connecting them to cosmic origins, and the Apkallu were invented to explain why knowledge seemed to come from nowhere, and the buried tablets of Sippar were a founding myth rather than a historical event, and the chain of transmission that the colophons describe was a conventional fiction that scribes maintained because it served institutional purposes, and this view is the standard scholarly interpretation, and it explains the evidence without requiring anything beyond normal human cultural processes, but it requires explaining why the Sumerians would have diminished their own achievements by attributing them to external sources, and why they would have constructed such an elaborate and consistent mythology of inheritance if they knew it to be false. Both interpretations have problems, and neither can be definitively established or ruled out with currently available evidence, and the first interpretation requires accepting that a sophisticated pre-flood civilization existed and was destroyed so completely that almost no direct archaeological evidence survives, which is a significant burden of proof, and the second interpretation requires accepting that the Sumerians engaged in systematic self-deprecation, attributing their greatest achievements to non-human sources for reasons that remain unclear, which is also problematic. And perhaps the truth involves elements of both, with real memory of earlier cultural achievements mythologized over time into divine transmission, and real scribal traditions of preservation elaborated into cosmic significance, and real flood catastrophes elevated into epochal boundaries between fundamentally different worlds. And what we can say with confidence is that the Sumerians themselves believed they were preservers rather than creators, and that this belief shaped their entire civilization, and that if we want to understand what they built and why they built it, we must take seriously the possibility that they knew something about their own origins that we have forgotten or never learned. The transition from active teaching to spiritual protection that the Apkallu underwent after the flood mirrors the broader transition that the texts describe in the relationship between human and divine realms, because before the flood the sages walked among humans and taught directly, and kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, and divine authority was immediate and present. But after the flood the sages withdrew into ritual invocation, and kings reigned for human lifespans, and divine authority was mediated through priesthood and temple and text. And this transition was not understood as progress or development, but as loss and diminishment, and the post-flood world was a lesser world farther from the source, and the best that later generations could hope for was to maintain connection to what had been through faithful preservation and proper ritual and accurate copying. And the anxiety that pervades Mesopotamian scribal culture is the anxiety of inheritors who know they are receiving a diminished inheritance, and who fear that each generation loses a little more, until eventually the connection is severed entirely, and everything the sages taught is finally and irreversibly forgotten. And perhaps this anxiety was justified, and perhaps the Sumerians really were preserving knowledge that was slowly degrading across generations, and perhaps by the time their civilization finally ended under the weight of Persian and Greek and Roman conquest, much of what they had received had indeed been lost, and what survived into the libraries of the classical world and through them into our own time is only a fragment of what the Apkallu originally transmitted when they emerged from the waters in the first year of human civilization and taught everything that constitutes civilized life. The royal inscriptions of Mesopotamia contain a phrase that appears so frequently across so many centuries and so many rulers that it must represent something fundamental about how these kings understood their own achievements, and that phrase in its various forms expresses the concept of restoration rather than creation, and the Sumerian verb yibil, which means to renew or to restore or to make as it was before, appears in building. Inscription after building inscription from the earliest dynastic periods through the final centuries of Babylonian independence, and when a king completed a temple or a palace or a ziggurat or a city wall, he did not boast of creating something new, but of restoring something ancient, and he did not claim to have improved upon the past, but to have faithfully replicated it, and he did not position himself as an innovator, but as a preserver. And this pattern is so consistent and so pervasive that it cannot be dismissed as mere convention or false modesty, but must reflect a genuine understanding of what royal building projects were supposed to accomplish, and what they actually meant to the people who commissioned them, and executed them, and dedicated them to the gods. Ur Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, who ruled around 2100 BCE, left inscriptions that demonstrate this pattern with particular clarity, because Ur Nammu was one of the most powerful rulers in Mesopotamian history, and his dynasty represents a high point of Sumerian civilization, and yet his inscriptions consistently describe his greatest achievements as restorations rather than creations. And when he built the great ziggurat at Ur, which still stands partially intact in modern Iraq, he did not claim to have designed something original, but wrote that he rebuilt the temple of Nana as it existed from distant days, and that phrase "from distant days" reaches back beyond his own dynasty, and beyond the dynasty before his, and beyond verifiable history into a past so remote that Ur Nammu himself could not have known exactly what the original looked like, and yet he claimed to be restoring it. And the archaeological evidence suggests he was not simply inventing this claim, because beneath his ziggurat archaeologists have found earlier construction phases extending back centuries before his reign, and the orientation and basic plan of his structure matches these earlier phases, as though he really was working from some template he inherited, rather than designing freely according to his own vision. Gudea of Lagash, who ruled around 2150 BCE, left even more detailed accounts of how royal building projects were understood and executed, because Gudea commissioned extensive construction at his capital city, and he recorded the process in a series of cylinder inscriptions that describe not just what he built, but how he received the plans. And according to these inscriptions, Gudea did not design his temples through his own creativity, or through consultation with human architects, but received the designs in dreams from the goddess Nisaba, who appeared to him holding a clay tablet inscribed with a star map and a temple plan, and the god Ningirsu, who showed him the completed temple in vision and instructed him to build according to what he had been shown. And Gudea describes waking from these dreams and seeking interpretation from other deities, and then executing the construction exactly as the divine blueprint specified, and the language throughout emphasizes reception rather than creation and obedience, rather than innovation and faithful replication of what was shown, rather than improvement or modification. And whether we interpret these dreams as literal divine communication, or as rhetorical convention, or as access to traditional architectural knowledge through ritual practice, the function is the same, which is to establish that the design did not originate with the human king, but came from a source beyond human invention. The inscriptions of Gudea describe the construction process itself in ways that reinforce this understanding of building as restoration, because Gudea writes that he sought out the ancient foundation platforms, and that he cleared away debris to find where earlier structures had stood, and that he aligned his new construction to match these ancient precedents. And he describes measuring and surveying with a precision that suggests he was working to specifications rather than inventing specifications. And he writes of consulting old tablets and examining ancient markers and following the practices established in ancient days. And throughout all of this, there is no suggestion that Gudea considered himself free to design as he wished, or that innovation was even possible, much less desirable. And the goal was always to match what had been, to restore what was lost, to maintain continuity with a past that was understood as sacred and normative and binding. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who ruled around 600 BCE, more than 1500 years after Gudea, left inscriptions that demonstrate the same pattern persisting into the final centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, because Nebuchadnezzar was perhaps the most powerful ruler in Babylonian history, commanding an empire that stretched from Egypt to Persia and building projects that made Babylon one of the wonders of the ancient world. And yet his inscriptions consistently describe these projects not as innovations, but as restorations. And when he rebuilt the great ziggurat of Babylon, called Etemenanki, the structure that may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel, he wrote that he had rebuilt the Etemenanki to its ancient height, and that he had raised its top to rival the heavens as it was in former times. And that phrase, "as it was in former times," is crucial because it establishes that Nebuchadnezzar understood himself not as creating something new, but as recovering something lost, and the ancient height he claims to have restored refers to a ziggurat that had been damaged and rebuilt multiple times across the preceding millennia. And his goal was not to surpass his predecessors, but to match them and to return the structure to whatever original form he believed it had possessed. The archaeological evidence supports these inscriptional claims because excavations across Mesopotamia have revealed that major structures were indeed rebuilt repeatedly on the same foundations following the same basic plans, and the ziggurats, which are the most distinctive form of Mesopotamian monumental architecture, show this pattern most clearly because a ziggurat is a stepped pyramid platform supporting a temple at its summit, and ziggurats were not built once and maintained, but were built and rebuilt and built again, with each successive ruler adding to or restoring what his predecessors had constructed. And when archaeologists excavate a ziggurat, they typically find multiple construction phases layered one atop another, with each phase following the same orientation and the same basic plan as the phases beneath it. And the ziggurat at Ur that Ur Nammu built in the 21st century BCE incorporated earlier construction from centuries before his time, and was itself restored and modified by rulers for centuries after his death. And through all these phases, the basic structure remained the same, and the orientation remained the same, and the sacred geometry was maintained with a precision that suggests the builders were working from inherited templates rather than designing freely. The temples at Eridu, which we discussed earlier, provide the most dramatic example of this pattern of faithful replication, because the 18 construction phases discovered beneath the historical period temple span more than 3,000 years, and through all those phases, the basic plan remains constant and the orientation never shifts, and the position of the altar never moves, and each successive temple is slightly larger than the one beneath it, but otherwise identical in design. And this cannot be explained by convenience or accident, but must reflect deliberate intent, because the builders across all those generations could have innovated at any point, and they chose not to, and they chose instead to replicate what had been there before, even when they could no longer have known exactly what the original looked like, or who had designed it, or why it took the form it did. And this commitment to replication across 3 millennia demonstrates that the restoration ideology expressed in royal inscriptions was not mere rhetoric, but actual practice, and that the Mesopotamians really did understand their building projects as attempts to maintain continuity with an ancient original rather than as opportunities for creative expression. The street grids of Mesopotamian cities show the same pattern of deliberate continuity because cities like Uruk and Nippur and Babylon maintained consistent street orientations across thousands of years of continuous occupation, and when buildings were destroyed by fire or flood or war and rebuilt, the new construction followed the same alignments as the old, and when entire neighbourhoods were reconstructed, the streets ran along the same axes they had followed for centuries, and this consistency cannot be explained by natural topography, because the Mesopotamian plain is flat and featureless, and provides no geographic constraints that would force streets to follow particular directions, and it cannot be explained by convenience because it would often have been easier to rebuild along new lines rather than to carefully maintain ancient alignments, and it can only be explained by deliberate intent, by a commitment to preserving the original layout of the city, even when the reasons for that layout were no longer understood, and this commitment extended beyond individual buildings to entire urban plans, as though the city itself was understood as an inherited template that must be maintained rather than a human creation that could be modified at will. The Nippur map provides direct evidence of this approach to urban planning, because this clay tablet dating to approximately 1500 BCE shows the layout of the city of Nippur in remarkable detail, with walls and gates and canals and temples and residential districts all carefully depicted. And the map is accurate enough that archaeologists have used it to guide excavations and have found structures exactly where the map indicates they should be. But here is what makes the map significant for understanding Mesopotamian attitudes toward the past, because the map includes structures that had been destroyed centuries before the tablet was created, and it shows the city not as it existed at the time of mapping, but as it was supposed to exist according to some ideal plan, and this means the mapmaker was not documenting contemporary reality, but preserving traditional knowledge, and the map functioned not as a guide to the current city, but as a record of what the city should look like, and this distinction between what is and what should be runs throughout Mesopotamian thought, with the past always serving as the normative standard, and the present always measured against what had been. The question that all of this evidence raises is where the original designs came from, because if Ur Nammu was restoring a ziggurat to its ancient form, then someone must have established that form originally. And if Gudea was building according to divine blueprints, then those blueprints must have existed before he received them. And if Nebuchadnezzar was returning a structure to its ancient height, then someone must have built it to that height in the first place. And the text consistently pushed the origin backward, attributing the original designs to the gods or to ancient times or to the period before the flood. And this attribution explains why the designs were considered sacred and unalterable, because if a temple plan came from the gods, then human builders were not free to modify it, and if a city layout was established in ancient days, then later generations were obligated to maintain it. And if the original construction occurred before the flood, then no living person could claim to know better than the original architects. The architectural sophistication of the earlier structures presents a puzzle that the restoration model intensifies rather than resolves, because if early Mesopotamian builders were already working from inherited templates, then those templates must have originated somewhere, and if the templates already encoded sophisticated astronomical alignments and mathematical proportions, then whoever created them must have possessed sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge, and the earliest temple at Eridu, dating to around 5400 BCE, already shows architectural features that required planning and measurement and understanding of load-bearing and spatial organization, and there are no cruder predecessors in the archaeological record, and there is no evidence of experimental phases where builders tried different approaches and learned from failures, and the architecture appears already knowing what it is doing. And this is the pattern we have seen repeatedly with Mesopotamian knowledge systems, where sophisticated capabilities appear without visible developmental stages, and where the Mesopotamians themselves attributed this sophistication not to their own achievement but to inheritance from before. The astronomical alignments of Mesopotamian structures provide particularly compelling evidence that the original designs encoded knowledge that must have taken centuries to accumulate, because the ziggurats and temples are oriented to cardinal directions with precision that requires careful astronomical observation, and the precision of these alignments suggests not casual orientation but deliberate calibration. And achieving such precision without modern instruments requires tracking the movements of celestial bodies over long periods, and noting where the sun rises and sets at solstices and equinoxes, and calculating the true north from stellar positions. And all of this presupposes astronomical knowledge that the standard developmental model says the Sumerians should not yet have possessed. At the time their earliest temples were constructed, and either the standard model is wrong and the Sumerians developed this knowledge much earlier than we assume, or the Sumerians really were working from inherited templates that already encoded astronomical information accumulated by someone else over the previous centuries, and the texts themselves support the second interpretation with their consistent claims that knowledge was received rather than discovered, and that the patterns guiding construction came from before. The ziggurat form itself encodes cosmological meaning that suggests the original design was not arbitrary, but purposeful, because the stepped pyramid rising in diminishing tiers toward a temple at the summit represents the connection between earth and heaven, and the ziggurat was called in Sumerian an Emen Ani, which means house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and this name reveals that the structure was understood as a physical link between terrestrial and celestial realms, and the 7 tiers of the later ziggurats corresponded to the 7 visible celestial bodies that the Mesopotamians tracked, and each tier was painted a different colour corresponding to planetary symbolism. And the temple at the summit was the meeting point where divine and human could communicate, and all of this symbolic complexity was already present in the earliest ziggurats, which means the cosmological meaning was not added later, but was part of the original design, and whoever created that design already understood the cosmos in sophisticated ways and already knew how to translate that understanding into architectural form. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the building of the first ziggurat by the gods themselves after they had established cosmic order. And according to this text, the gods decided to build a shrine where they could rest when they came to earth, and they made bricks and raised the structure tier by tier until its top reached the heavens. And only after this divine construction was complete did they create humanity to maintain what had been built. And this narrative establishes the ziggurat as a divine creation that humans subsequently preserved, rather than a human invention that evolved over time, and whether or not this narrative reflects historical memory or theological construction, the function is the same, which is to place the origin of the ziggurat form outside human invention, and to establish that human builders were always replicating a divine original rather than creating something new. The problem with the restoration model is that it leads backward into a past that cannot be verified, because if Nebuchadnezzar was restoring what Ur Nammu had built, and Ur Nammu was restoring what earlier rulers had built, and those earlier rulers were restoring what had existed before the flood, then the chain of transmission leads beyond the archaeological record into a period we cannot access directly, and at some point the chain must begin with an original that was not itself a restoration, and the texts consistently locate this original in the antediluvian period, when the gods or their intermediaries established the patterns that later generations would maintain. And this is either a theological fiction designed to authorize present practice or a genuine memory of pre-flood origins that have been lost to archaeology. And the evidence does not allow us to determine which interpretation is correct, but the consistency of the Mesopotamian claims deserves more consideration than it typically receives. What makes the restoration model significant is not whether it is literally true, but what it reveals about how the Mesopotamians understood their own civilization, because a culture that defines its greatest achievements as restorations rather than innovations has a fundamentally different relationship to knowledge and authority and progress than a culture that values originality and improvement. And the Mesopotamians clearly believed that the past was superior to the present, and that their responsibility was to maintain connection to that past rather than to transcend it. And this belief shaped everything they built and everything they wrote, and everything they preserved, and even their most powerful kings defined greatness, not as surpassing predecessors, but as faithfully replicating them. And this is not how a culture behaves when it believes it is ascending. And this is not the narrative of a civilization, confident in its own creative capacity, but the narrative of inheritors anxious about losing what they received. The contrast with modern assumptions about civilization could not be sharper, because we believe that progress is possible, and that innovation is valuable, and that the future will be better than the past. And we celebrate originality and reward disruption, and teach our children that they can improve upon what their parents built, and the Mesopotamians believed none of this. And they would have found our assumptions bewildering and dangerous, because from their perspective, innovation was not progress, but degradation, and originality was not creativity, but loss of connection to the source, and the future would be worse than the past, because each generation stood farther from the original and understood less of what had been transmitted. And from this perspective, the highest achievement was not to create something new, but to preserve something old, and the measure of a civilization was not its capacity for innovation, but its fidelity to tradition. Perhaps the Mesopotamians were simply wrong, and perhaps they were limited by primitive theology and static social structures, and perhaps their achievements really were human inventions that they falsely attributed to divine sources. And perhaps the Restoration ideology was a conservative fiction designed to prevent change and maintain elite power. And this is the standard scholarly interpretation, and it may be correct, but it requires explaining why the Mesopotamians would have created such a self-diminishing narrative, and why they would have maintained it so consistently across 3,000 years, and why they would have organised their entire civilization around a fiction they knew to be false, and perhaps they did not know it was false. And perhaps they genuinely believed they were inheritors, and perhaps they had reasons for that belief that we cannot access from the fragmentary evidence that survives, and perhaps this question of where the original designs came from remains open despite our confidence that the answer must involve human invention. The trail of transmission leads backward and does not arrive at a clear beginning, because every restoration points to an earlier original, and every earlier original points to something earlier still. And the texts themselves eventually place the origin before the flood in a period when divine beings or their intermediaries established the patterns that would govern all subsequent construction, and archaeology cannot confirm or deny what existed before the flood, because the flood deposits mark a discontinuity beyond which the record becomes fragmentary and ambiguous, and either the Mesopotamians were projecting imaginary origins into a mythological past, or they were preserving genuine memory of a pre-flood world that we cannot independently verify, and the evidence supports both interpretations and neither can be definitively established. What we can establish is that the Mesopotamians behaved as though they were inheritors, and that their behaviour shaped their civilization in distinctive ways, and that the buildings they constructed, and the texts they preserved, and the knowledge they transmitted all bear the marks of a culture oriented toward preservation rather than innovation. And this orientation persisted for 3,000 years, which is longer than any modern civilization has existed, and perhaps their approach worked, and perhaps the restoration model provided stability that innovation could not offer, and perhaps the commitment to maintaining connection with the past enabled the transmission of knowledge across catastrophic disruptions that would have destroyed a culture less focused on preservation, and perhaps the Mesopotamian answer to the question of how civilization survives was the answer they actually practiced, which was to copy faithfully and build on ancient foundations, and treat the designs of the past as sacred, templates rather than as starting points for improvement. The inscriptions end, but the questions they raise persist, because if Mesopotamian kings across 3,000 years consistently describe their achievements as restorations, then either they were all engaged in the same elaborate fiction, or they all believed the same thing about their relationship to the past. And if they all believed the same thing, then either that belief was groundless convention, or it reflected something real about how their civilization had originated and transmitted itself. And the evidence does not allow us to choose definitively between these alternatives, but it does establish that the restoration model was central to Mesopotamian self-understanding, and that any account of Mesopotamian civilization that ignores or dismisses this model is incomplete, and that the question of where the original designs came from deserves more attention than it has received from scholars committed to the assumption that human civilization is necessarily and always a human creation. The pattern we have been tracing through Mesopotamian texts and archaeology might seem unique to that civilization and explicable as a local theological tradition with no broader significance. But when we turn our attention to ancient Egypt, we encounter something that should give us pause, because the Egyptians who developed their civilization independently along the Nile, with no documented contact with Mesopotamia during the formative periods, preserved an almost identical narrative structure describing a time when gods ruled directly, followed by a transitional period of semi-divine beings, followed by human pharaohs whose reigns could be historically verified. And this parallel either represents an astonishing coincidence of independent mythological development, or suggests that both civilizations were preserving memory of a shared experience that predated their separate emergence, and the evidence for the Egyptian version of this pattern is extensive and well documented, and deserves careful examination because it raises questions that standard models of cultural development struggle to answer. The Turin King List, also called the Turin Royal Canon, is a papyrus document now held in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, that was composed during the reign of Ramesses around 1250 BCE, and that lists every ruler of Egypt in chronological order, beginning not with the first human pharaoh but with the reign of the gods themselves. And when the papyrus was first acquired by European collectors in the early 19th century, it was in fragments, and piecing it together took decades of painstaking work. but when the reconstruction was complete, scholars found something that mirrored the Sumerian king list with remarkable precision, because the Turin Papyrus begins with a section describing divine rulers whose reigns lasted for thousands of years, and it names Ptah, who ruled for 9,000 years, and Ra, who ruled for 1,000 years, and Shu and Geb and Osiris and Set and Horus, each governing Egypt for extended periods before any human claimed the throne. And the papyrus treats these divine reigns with the same matter-of-fact administrative tone that characterizes the rest of the document, listing reign lengths and noting transitions of power as though documenting ordinary bureaucratic succession rather than theological abstraction. After the divine rulers, the Turin Papyrus describes a transitional period governed by beings called the Shemsu Hor, which translates as the followers of Horus, and these figures occupied a category between fully divine and fully human, serving as a bridge between the age of the gods and the age of the pharaohs, and the papyrus records that the Shemsu Hor ruled for thousands of years, maintaining the order established by the gods and preparing the way for human governance, and only after this extended transitional period does the document reach Menes, who is traditionally considered the first human pharaoh and the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE. And from Menes forward, the Turin Papyrus records rulers whose reigns can be correlated with archaeological evidence, and whose existence is independently verified. But the preceding sections describing divine and semi-divine rule are treated identically with no shift in tone or format to indicate that the scribe considered them less factual than the historical dynasties that followed. The concept underlying this chronological structure is called Zep Tepi in Egyptian, which translates as the first time or the first occasion, and Zep Tepi refers to the original moment when cosmic order was established, when the gods first organized the world and instituted the principles of Emarat, or truth and justice and proper order, that would govern all subsequent existence. And according to Egyptian theology, everything that happened after Zep Tepi was either maintenance of the original order or deviation from it. And the role of the pharaoh was not to innovate or progress, but to maintain Marat and to ensure that Egypt continued to operate according to the principles established in the first time. And this understanding of the present as obligated to the past and of governance as preservation rather than creation exactly parallels what we found in Mesopotamian thought, and the Egyptian version is, if anything, even more explicit about the superiority of the original age and the diminishment that followed, because the Egyptians believed that each successive age moved further from the perfection of Zep Tepi, and that the best any ruler could achieve was to slow this decline rather than to reverse it or transcend it. Manetho was an Egyptian priest who lived in the 3rd century BCE during the Ptolemaic period, and who composed a history of Egypt in Greek for the benefit of the new Hellenistic rulers. And while his original work has been lost, fragments survive in the writings of later authors who quoted him, and according to these fragments, Manetho described Egyptian history as extending back 36,525 years before Menes, with this vast span of time divided into periods of divine rule, followed by periods of semi-divine rule, followed by the human dynasties, and Manetho claimed to be drawing on temple records, and his chronology was later used by early Christian writers attempting to reconcile Egyptian history with biblical chronology. And while modern scholars dismiss these extended time spans as mythological exaggeration or calendrical confusion, the structure itself is significant because it demonstrates that Egyptian chronological thinking followed the same pattern we find in Mesopotamia, with divine governance preceding human governance, and a catastrophic transition marking the boundary between ages. The Palermo stone, which survives only in fragments, provides additional evidence for early Egyptian chronological thinking, because this stone dated to the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE records royal annals beginning with pre-dynastic rulers whose names appear alongside records of Nile flood heights and ritual activities, and the stone's earliest sections describe rulers from before the unification of Egypt. Rulers whose names are partially preserved but whose historical existence cannot be independently verified, and the structure of the Palermo stone, like the structure of the Turin Papyrus and Manetho's history, presents Egyptian civilization as emerging from an earlier period of governance that predated what archaeology can confirm, and this consistent pattern across documents separated by centuries and composed for different purposes suggests that the Egyptians genuinely believed their civilization had originated in a period beyond historical memory, when beings who were not fully human had established the order that later generations inherited. The archaeological questions raised by this Egyptian material focus particularly on structures, whose dating and origin remain contested, and the most famous of these controversies involves the Great Sphinx of Giza, which mainstream Egyptology dates to the reign of Khafra around 2500 BCE, but which shows patterns of erosion that some researchers argue indicate much greater age. And the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University has argued that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls were caused by water, specifically by prolonged rainfall of a type that has not occurred in Egypt since before 5000 BCE. And if this analysis is correct, it would place the original carving of the Sphinx thousands of years earlier than the conventional dating, and would raise questions about who carved it and what civilization possessed the capability for such monumental construction at such an early date. And while this hypothesis remains controversial and is rejected by most Egyptologists, the debate itself demonstrates that questions about the age and origin of Egyptian monuments are not entirely settled. The Osirison at Abydos presents similar questions because this structure located behind the Temple of Seti was long thought to be a cenotaph built by Seti around 1280 BCE, but the construction technique differs dramatically from the surrounding New Kingdom architecture, and the Osirian is built from massive granite and limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, using a style that more closely resembles Old Kingdom construction or even earlier work, and the structure sits significantly below the current ground level, as though it was built when the ground surface was lower and has been buried over subsequent millennia. And some researchers have suggested that the Osirion is much older than its supposed New Kingdom. Date. And that Seti I did not build it, but discovered it and incorporated it into his temple complex, and while mainstream Egyptology maintains the conventional dating, the structure remains anomalous and difficult to explain within standard chronological frameworks. The significance of these archaeological controversies for our investigation is not that they prove the Egyptian chronology is correct, but that they demonstrate unresolved questions about the origins and age of Egyptian civilization, and if the Egyptians believed their civilization was a continuation of something older, and if some structures present anomalies that the standard timeline struggles to explain, then the possibility exists that Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions of pre-flood or prehistorical civilization preserve genuine memory rather than pure mythology. And the parallel structure of the two traditions, despite the lack of documented contact between the cultures during their formative periods, suggests either that humans universally invent the same mythological patterns, or that both cultures were remembering something that actually happened. The Hindu tradition, preserved in texts like the Puranas and the Mahabharata, describes a cosmological structure that parallels the Mesopotamian and Egyptian patterns with even greater elaboration, because Hindu cosmology divides time into vast cycles called yugas, and the current cycle began with Satya Yuga, the Age of Truth, which lasted for 1,728,000 years. And during Satya Yuga, humanity lived in direct contact with the divine, and lifespans extended for thousands of years, and Dharma or cosmic law was perfectly maintained, and there was no need for written texts because knowledge was directly perceived and perfectly remembered. And after Satya Yuga came Treta Yuga, which lasted 1,296,000 years, and during which conditions began to decline, and lifespans shortened, and Dharma was reduced to 3/4 of its original fullness, and after Treta Yuga came Dvapara Yuga, lasting 864,000 years with further decline and further shortening of lifespans, and finally the current age, Kali Yuga, lasting 432,000 years, which began approximately 5,000 years ago, and which represents the maximum distance from the original Golden Age and the lowest point of cosmic decline. The structure of the yugas exactly parallels what we find in Mesopotamian and Egyptian thought, with an original age of divine presence and extended lifespans followed by progressive decline and increasing distance from the source, and the reign lengths of the Sumerian king list, which decrease systematically from tens of thousands of years before the flood to human lifespans afterward, mirror the decreasing lifespans of the yugas, and the Egyptian understanding of Zep-Tepi as a perfect original from which all subsequent ages represent deviation parallels, the Hindu understanding of Satya Yuga as a golden age from which humanity has been progressively falling, and these parallels cannot be explained by cultural contact because the Hindu tradition developed independently in South Asia with no documented connection to Mesopotamian or Egyptian civilization during the formative periods, and either all three civilizations independently invented the same elaborate structure of declining ages, or all three were preserving memory of something they had in common. The Hindu tradition also describes how knowledge was preserved across the catastrophic transitions between ages through the composition and transmission of sacred texts, and the Vedas, which are the foundational scriptures of Hindu tradition, are understood not as human compositions but as Shruti, or that which was heard, meaning divine revelation perceived by ancient sages and transmitted faithfully across generations. And the sages who received the Vedas were not authors but channels, and their role was preservation, not creation. And the texts themselves are treated as having existed eternally and as having been revealed anew at the beginning of each cosmic cycle, so that the knowledge they contain is always available to those who preserve it faithfully. And this understanding of sacred knowledge as received rather than invented exactly parallels what we found in Mesopotamian concepts of the Emi and Egyptian concepts of Zep Tepi. The Mesoamerican traditions of Central America and Mexico present perhaps the most striking parallels, because these traditions developed in complete isolation from the Old World, with no possible contact before the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century, and yet Mesoamerican cosmology describes the same pattern of successive ages, each ending in catastrophe, and each representing a stage in a cosmic cycle, and the Aztec tradition recorded after the Spanish conquest describes 5 ages, or suns, with the current age being the 5th sun, and the 4 previous suns having ended in destruction by jaguar, by wind, by fire, and by flood, and each previous age had its own form of humanity and its own gods, and each ended when the cosmic order became unstable and catastrophe swept away what had been built and the survivors, or the gods themselves then created a new age with new conditions. And the 5th sun, which is the current age, will also end in destruction, completing the cycle. The figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, appears across Mesoamerican cultures as a culture bringer who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and Quetzalcoatl is credited with teaching agriculture and astronomy and the calendar and writing and architecture, and his origin varies in different tellings, but frequently involves arrival from across the sea from the east, and his departure also involves the sea with promises to return. And the parallels to the Mesopotamian Apkallu are striking, because both traditions describe non-human or semi-divine figures who arrived from elsewhere and who taught the foundational knowledge of civilization and who eventually departed, leaving humanity to maintain what had been transmitted. And the Aztec tradition even describes Quetzalcoatl as associated with the planet Venus, which was also the celestial body most carefully tracked in Mesopotamian astronomy, suggesting either coincidence or some connection that standard historical models cannot explain. The Olmec civilization, which flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico between approximately 1500 and 400 BCE, presents archaeological puzzles similar to those we encountered in Mesopotamia and Egypt, because Olmec civilization appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated with monumental stone heads and complex iconography and architectural centres and long-distance trade networks, and the developmental stages that should precede such complexity are not clearly visible. And the Olmec were the first major civilization in Mesoamerica, and subsequent cultures including the Maya and the Aztec trace their origins to Olmec foundations, and yet where the Olmec themselves came from, and how they developed their sophisticated culture so rapidly remains unclear. And the Olmec themselves, according to what can be reconstructed, from their iconography believed that their knowledge came from elsewhere, that they were recipients rather than originators. And this pattern of sudden sophistication without clear developmental stages parallels what we find in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Chinese tradition, preserved in texts like the records of the Grand Historian and the Bamboo Annals, describes a period before the historical dynasties when China was governed by divine or semi-divine figures called the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors. And the 3 sovereigns include Fuxi, who is credited with revealing the Yijing or Book of Changes, and with teaching humanity to fish and hunt and domesticate animals, and Nuwa, who is associated with creation and with repairing the sky after a catastrophic damage. And Shennong, who taught agriculture and herbal medicine, and the 3 sovereigns are followed by the 5 emperors, who are semi-divine figures ruling for extended periods and establishing the foundations of Chinese civilization. And only after this extended period of divine and semi-divine rule does Chinese tradition reach the historical dynasties, beginning with the Xia around 2070 BCE, and even the Xia dynasty was considered semi-legendary, until archaeological discoveries in the 20th century began to provide evidence supporting its existence. The Chinese tradition, like the Mesopotamian and Egyptian, and Hindu and Mesoamerican traditions, places the origin of civilization in a period beyond historical verification and credits the origin to beings who were not fully human, and describes knowledge as transmitted from that earlier period rather than developed through human experimentation. And the specifics differ because Chinese tradition does not emphasize a flood catastrophe in the same way and does not describe the same pattern of declining ages, but the structural similarity remains with divine governance, preceding human governance, and with foundational knowledge arriving from outside humans, invention, and with later generations positioned as inheritors, maintaining what they received rather than creators developing something new. The global distribution of these parallel traditions raises a question that has two possible answers, and neither answer is fully satisfying because either these traditions developed independently, in which case we must explain why human cultures universally invent the same specific structure of divine ages, followed by catastrophe, followed by human inheritance, or these traditions preserve shared memory of actual events, in which case we must explain how that memory could be shared across cultures that had no documented contact during the relevant periods. And the first answer appeals to universal psychology, suggesting that humans naturally project authority onto imagined ancestors and naturally construct mythologies that elevate the past over the present. And this explanation has the advantage of not requiring anything beyond ordinary human cognitive processes, but it struggles to explain the specificity of the parallels because generic ancestor worship does not require elaborate chronological structures with mathematically precise reign lengths, and it does not require culture-bringing figures who arrive from across the sea, and it does not require systematic descriptions of declining ages with decreasing lifespans. The second answer appeals to shared historical experience, suggesting that before the civilizations we know emerged, there was an earlier global or widespread civilization whose memory was preserved fragmentarily by the cultures that survived its collapse. And this explanation accounts for the specificity of the parallels, but it requires accepting that such a civilization existed and was destroyed so completely that only indirect memory survives, and mainstream archaeology does not support this hypothesis, because no direct evidence of such a civilization has been found, and the hypothesis remains in the realm of speculation, rather than established fact. A third possibility exists between these extremes, which is that the catastrophic events described in the traditions were real, even if the civilizations that preceded them were not as sophisticated as the mythologies suggest, and we know that catastrophic flooding occurred around 2900 BCE in Mesopotamia. And we know that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, flooding coastal areas worldwide, and we know that human populations were devastated repeatedly by natural disasters throughout prehistory. And it is possible that the traditions preserve memory of real catastrophes while elaborating the pre-catastrophe period into mythological golden ages, and this interpretation takes the catastrophes seriously, without requiring acceptance of antediluvian civilizations possessed of sophisticated knowledge. The question of what actually happened remains open, and the evidence does not allow definitive resolution, but the pattern itself is significant, regardless of its explanation, because the pattern appears across cultures that developed independently and across traditions that could not have borrowed from each other, and the pattern consistently describes the present as diminished relative to the past, and positions humanity as inheritors rather than creators, and treats preservation as the highest responsibility and views innovation with suspicion rather than celebration. And this pattern shaped civilizations across the ancient world and influenced how billions of people understood their relationship to knowledge and authority and time, and whatever its origin. The pattern represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about human civilization than the progressive developmental model that dominates modern thought. The modern assumption that civilization develops from simple to complex, and that the present is superior to the past, and that innovation improves upon tradition, is not universal and is in fact historically recent, and most human civilizations throughout most of human history have assumed the opposite and have organized themselves around preservation rather than progress, and have measured their achievements by fidelity to the past rather than departure from it. And the global pattern of second civilization memory, whether it reflects actual events or universal psychology, represents this older understanding, and challenges us to consider whether our progressive assumptions are accurate or whether the ancients knew something about the origins of civilization that we have forgotten or dismissed. The parallels continue to accumulate the more traditions one examines, because similar patterns appear in Polynesian cultures, describing ancient navigators who established civilization across the Pacific, and in African traditions describing founders who came from elsewhere, and in Native American traditions describing previous world ages destroyed by catastrophe, and in Norse mythology describing cycles of creation and destruction, and the pattern is not identical in every culture, but the structural similarities are striking enough that they cannot be dismissed as coincidence, and whether these similarities reflect shared human psychology or shared human experience or some combination of both. They establish that the Mesopotamian understanding of civilization as inheritance was not an isolated local phenomenon, but part of a global pattern that deserves serious investigation. The question we are left with is why cultures across the world with no documented contact would preserve the same basic narrative about their origins, and the same basic understanding of their relationship to the past, and the same basic anxiety about maintaining connection to knowledge they did not create. And the answers proposed by different researchers range from psychological universals to diffusionist theories to ancient astronaut speculation, and none of these answers is fully satisfying, and perhaps the honest conclusion is that we do not know, and perhaps the appropriate response is not to choose an answer prematurely, but to sit with the question and to acknowledge that the origins of human civilization remain more mysterious than our confident textbook narratives suggest. And perhaps the ancient traditions preserved something important that we have lost, which is the recognition that what we know may not be our own achievement, and that maintaining it may be more important than transcending it, and that somewhere behind the confident facade of modern civilization lies an inheritance whose source we no longer remember. The question of what it meant to live as inheritors shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian civilization in ways that we who believe ourselves to be creators and innovators can barely imagine. Because when you believe that the knowledge you possess was given rather than discovered, and when you believe that the systems governing your world were designed by someone wiser than yourself, and when you believe that your highest responsibility is to maintain what you received rather than to improve upon it, then everything changes, and the way you train your scribes changes, and the way you build your temples changes, and the way you govern your cities changes, and the way you relate to time itself changes, because time is no longer an opportunity for progress, but a threat of degradation. And every generation stands farther from the source than the generation before, and every copy of a sacred text is potentially less accurate than the copy it was made from, and every rebuilt temple is potentially less faithful to the original design, and the entire civilization becomes organized around the desperate effort to slow this inevitable decline and to preserve as much as possible for as long as possible, before the connection to the origin is finally and irreversibly severed. The scribal culture of Mesopotamia embodied this preservation anxiety more completely than any other institution, because the scribes were the human links in the chain of transmission, and they understood their role not as interpreting or expanding the knowledge they received, but as copying it exactly and passing it forward unchanged, and their training emphasized accuracy above all else, with students spending years copying and recopying standard texts until they could reproduce them without error. And the texts themselves warned against alteration with colophons that cursed anyone who changed what had been written. And the ideal scribe was not creative or original, but faithful and precise and invisible, because the text should pass through the scribe without being marked by his individual presence. And this understanding of scribal work as transmission rather than authorship explains why so few individual Mesopotamian writers are known by name, because the name of the scribe did not matter. And what mattered was the text and the chain of transmission connecting the present copy to the original source. The anxiety that pervades Mesopotamian scribal literature reveals how seriously the scribes took their preservation responsibility, because tablets describe the difficulty of reading damaged originals and the uncertainty about whether reconstructions are accurate and the fear that errors have crept in despite every precaution. And one text from the Old Babylonian period contains a lament that has haunted everyone who has read it. Because the scribe writes that the old writings are damaged, and that the ancient knowledge grows dim, and that we copy what we can understand and preserve what we cannot. And this admission that the scribes were already struggling to maintain knowledge, whose meaning was becoming obscure, demonstrates that the transmission chain was not perfect, and that loss was occurring despite every effort to prevent it. And the scribes knew they were losing ground, and they knew that each generation understood a little less than the generation before, and yet they kept copying and kept preserving, because the alternative was to give up entirely and to let the connection to the past be severed completely. The temple rituals of Mesopotamia served the same preservation function as the scribal copying, because the rituals were understood not as human inventions, but as divinely established practices that maintained cosmic order, and the priests who performed these rituals were not free to modify them or to innovate based on their own understanding, because the power of the ritual depended on its accuracy and on its faithful replication of what had been done before. And the ritual texts specify every gesture and every word and every offering in precise detail, and Deviations were not just errors, but dangers, because an incorrectly performed ritual might fail to maintain the cosmic order it was designed to support, and the entire system might begin to unravel. And this understanding of ritual as maintenance technology rather than religious expression explains the elaborate precision of Mesopotamian ceremonial practice and the anxiety that surrounded any uncertainty about proper procedure. The psychological weight of living in this worldview must have been considerable, because to believe that you are an inheritor rather than a creator is to believe that your highest achievements are at best faithful copies and at worst degraded approximations of something you can never fully understand, and to believe that the golden age lies in the past rather than the future is to believe that your civilization is declining rather than progressing, and that your children will know less than you knew, and their children less still. And to believe that your primary responsibility is preservation rather than innovation is to believe that the most you can hope for is to slow the rate of loss and to maintain the connection for one more generation. And this is not an uplifting worldview, and it is not a worldview that encourages ambition or celebrates human potential, and it is fundamentally tragic because it assumes that the best is already past, and that everything since has been a long, slow falling away from a perfection that can be remembered but never recovered. And yet Mesopotamian civilization endured for more than 3,000 years and produced achievements in mathematics and astronomy and literature and law that would not be equalled for millennia. And the preservation orientation did not prevent accomplishment, but channeled it in directions we might not expect, because when innovation is not valued for its own sake, then energy flows into refinement and precision and depth, rather than novelty and breadth, and the astronomical observations that the Mesopotamians accumulated over centuries represent exactly this kind of achievement, because they did not try to create new cosmological theories, but instead patiently refined their observations and calculations until they achieved a precision that remains impressive today, and the mathematical techniques they developed served practical purposes of surveying and accounting and astronomy, and were refined over generations until they could solve problems that would not be solved again in the West until the Renaissance, and the legal traditions they maintained provided stability and predictability across thousands or so of years of dynastic change and foreign conquest. And the civilization that resulted was not dynamic in the way we value dynamism, but it was enduring in ways that our restless, innovative cultures may not be able to match. The comparison to modernity is uncomfortable because we have built our civilization on exactly opposite assumptions, and we believe that progress is possible, and that innovation is valuable, and that the future will be better than the past, and we celebrate originality and reward disruption, and teach our children that they can transcend what their parents achieved, and our entire economic system depends on growth, and our entire educational system depends on the production of new knowledge, and our entire sense of meaning depends on the belief that we are going somewhere rather than falling away from somewhere. And if the Mesopotamian worldview was correct, then all of this is illusion, and we are not ascending but declining, and we are not discovering but forgetting, and we are not building something new but failing to maintain something old, and the confident progress narrative that structures modern consciousness would be not just wrong, but dangerously wrong, because it would be preventing us from doing the one thing that actually matters, which is preserving what we have received before it is lost forever. But perhaps the Mesopotamian worldview was not correct, and perhaps they were simply wrong about the origins of their knowledge, and perhaps the sophisticated systems they possessed really did develop through human experimentation over generations that left no archaeological trace, and perhaps the divine attributions and antediluvian chronologies were theological constructions designed to establish authority rather than preserve memory. And perhaps the Restoration ideology was conservative fiction maintained by elites who benefited from preventing change, and this is the standard scholarly interpretation, and it may be accurate. And if it is accurate, then the Mesopotamian anxiety about preservation was misplaced, and their tragic worldview was unnecessary, and their civilization could have been more dynamic and more progressive if they had recognized their own creative capacity instead of projecting it onto imaginary divine sources. And this interpretation is comforting because it reassures us that our modern assumptions are correct, and that progress really is possible, and that we are not living in the aftermath of something greater than ourselves. The honest assessment of what we can and cannot know requires acknowledging that neither interpretation can be definitively established with available evidence, because the Mesopotamian texts consistently claim that knowledge was inherited, and the archaeological record does not clearly show the developmental stages we would expect if knowledge was independently invented, and the parallel traditions across unconnected cultures either represent universal psychology or shared memory. and we cannot determine which, and the flood deposits confirm that catastrophic flooding occurred, but cannot confirm or deny what existed before the catastrophe. And the restoration inscriptions demonstrate that Mesopotamian kings understood their building projects as replications of ancient originals, but cannot confirm whether those originals really existed or were theological projections. And at every point the evidence is consistent with multiple interpretations, and choosing between them requires assumptions that cannot themselves be verified. 3 interpretive positions represent the range of possibilities, and each has evidence to support it and problems to resolve, and the first position holds that the Mesopotamian traditions are purely mythological, representing the universal human tendency to project authority onto imaginary ancestors and to construct golden ages in the past as criticism of the present. And according to this view, the antediluvian kings and the Apkallu and the buried tablets of Sippar are fictional constructs, and that restoration inscriptions are rhetorical conventions and the sophisticated knowledge systems developed through ordinary human processes whose early stages simply were not preserved. And this position has the advantage of requiring nothing beyond established human capacities, but it struggles to explain the specificity and consistency of the traditions and the global parallels across unconnected cultures. The second position holds that the Mesopotamian traditions preserve distorted memory of actual historical predecessors who were Yis or human, but whose achievements were mythologized over time into divine status. And according to this view, there really was a pre-flood civilization possessing sophisticated knowledge, and the flood really did destroy that civilization, and survivors really did preserve what they could and transmit it to subsequent generations who built the historical civilizations we can document and the divine attributions represent later. Elaboration of what were originally human accomplishments, and this position accounts for the consistency of the traditions and the absence of developmental stages, but it requires accepting that a sophisticated civilization existed and was destroyed so completely that only indirect memory survives. The third position holds that the evidence cannot yet accommodate what actually happened, and that our categories of natural and supernatural and mythological and historical may not apply cleanly to whatever occurred at the dawn of civilization. And according to this view, the texts may be describing something real that we lack the conceptual framework to understand, and the Apkallu may have been actual beings whose nature we cannot determine from fragmentary evidence, and the knowledge transmission may have occurred through processes we cannot reconstruct, and this position has the advantage of intellectual humility, but the disadvantage of explaining nothing because it simply defers the question to future evidence that may never materialize. What the evidence shows with reasonable confidence is that the Sumerians genuinely believed they were inheritors, and that this belief shaped their civilization in fundamental ways, and that similar beliefs appeared independently across cultures worldwide, and that the archaeological record contains anomalies that standard developmental models struggle to explain, and that the question of what happened at the origin of civilization remains more open than confident textbook narratives suggest. And beyond these points, confidence must yield to uncertainty, and the mystery remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable with evidence currently available. The closing meditation that this investigation invites concerns not the past but the present and the future, because if the Mesopotamians were correct, and if their civilization was built on inherited knowledge whose source they could not fully access, then the question arises whether we might be in the same position, and whether the confidence with which we claim to understand our own knowledge might be as misplaced as any confidence they had. And we inherit our mathematics from centuries of accumulated development, and we inherit our physics from generations of experimental refinement, and we inherit our medicine from millennia of practical experience, and we inherit our languages from ancestors whose origins disappear into prehistory, and we inherit our cognitive capacities from evolutionary processes. We can describe but not fully explain, and at every level we are inheritors, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the question is only how much we have lost in the transmission, and how much we have forgotten that we once knew. The technologies that sustain modern civilization are understood by almost no one in their completeness, and the systems that organize our societies are maintained by specialists who understand their particular components but not the whole, and the knowledge that enables a smartphone to function, or a power grid to operate, or an economy to coordinate the activities of billions of people is distributed across millions of minds, none of whom possess more than a fragment, and if catastrophe struck, and if the specialists were lost, and if the institutions that trained them collapsed, then how much could be preserved and how much would be lost, and would future generations looking back at the ruins of our civilization wonder what we knew, and how we lost it? And would they construct their own traditions of a golden age when knowledge was complete and systems functioned, and order was maintained by the beings who understood what they were doing. The Mesopotamian scribes worried that they were losing knowledge and that each generation understood less than the generation before, and we assume that we are gaining knowledge and that each generation understands more than the generation before. But both assumptions could be wrong, and knowledge could be simultaneously growing in some domains and declining in others. And we could be gaining technical capability while losing wisdom and gaining information, while losing understanding and gaining power, while losing the ability to use it responsibly. And the Mesopotamian worldview, with all its tragic resignation, may contain a warning that our optimistic worldview needs to hear, which is that knowledge is fragile, and that transmission is imperfect, and that loss is always possible, and that the confident assumption that progress is inevitable may be the most dangerous form of forgetting. If humanity has forgotten more than it remembers, then what might we be forgetting now? And this question cannot be answered, because by definition we cannot know what we have forgotten, but we can notice the gaps and the anomalies and the puzzles that our confident narratives cannot explain, and we can notice that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge. We struggle to account for, and we can notice that traditions worldwide describe a pattern of inheritance and decline that contradicts our assumptions about progress, and we can notice that our own civilization, despite its unprecedented power, rests on foundations that very few understand. And we can wonder whether future archaeologists sifting through our ruins will find evidence of sophisticated systems that appeared suddenly, without clear developmental stages, and will construct their own theories about where our knowledge came from and why we could not maintain it. The story we have been exploring tonight does not end with a conclusion, because the evidence does not support conclusions. An honest investigation requires acknowledging what remains unknown, and the Sumerians believed they were inheritors of a world that ended in catastrophe, and they organized their civilization around the preservation of what had been given, and they worried that they were losing what they had received, and they copied their tablets faithfully and rebuilt their temples exactly and performed their rituals precisely because they believed that the alternative was complete disconnection from the source. And whether they were right or wrong, their civilization endured for 3,000 years and transmitted its knowledge forward through catastrophe after catastrophe, until it reached us across 5 millennia of transmission, and we are reading their tablets now and puzzling over their claims and wondering whether they knew something we have forgotten. The quiet has deepened as we have travelled together through these ancient mysteries, and the hour is late wherever you are, and the questions we have explored do not resolve into comfortable answers, and perhaps that is appropriate because the most important questions rarely do, and the investigation continues even as this particular journey ends, and the tablets remain in their museum cases, and the ziggurats remain as eroded mounds on the Mesopotamian plain, and the texts remain waiting to be translated and interpreted and argued over by scholars who will never fully agree, and the pattern of inheritance and preservation and loss that we have traced remains visible across cultures worldwide, and the mystery of origins remains open, and will perhaps remain open forever. And in the silence that follows these words, you are left with questions rather than answers, and with uncertainty rather than confidence, and with the strange possibility that the beginning we have been taught may have been a second beginning, and that somewhere behind everything we think we know lies a world we have forgotten, and that the scribes who worried about loss may have been right to worry, and that the chain of transmission connecting us to the past may be more fragile than we assume, and that preservation may matter more than innovation, and that the weight of inheritance may be heavier than we acknowledge, and that in the end we too are inheritors, struggling to maintain what we have received, uncertain of its source and anxious about its loss, and hoping that the next generation will understand more than we do, while fearing that they may understand less.